nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prananatha Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdnani Patyakshito. Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Yashri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadana-strinam dantoye yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhyudisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haitrurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Parakamala Shrita Chetasame Chittam Satam Marukari Atupada Padme Bhakterya Nikilarta Varga Jananiya Brahma Sakshat Krite Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Padam Bhaja Yugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Yahakarya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah Yaram Yanikilaga Sanga Shamani Shrutra Tritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mahita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, Sri Rupa Gosvami Prabhupada. Again, today we continue our discussion of Padyavali. And we resume here in the section on Bhagavad-dharma-tattva, in particular in discussion of the subject of Guru-tattva, with reference to this verse 114, and the censure in the verse of, quote, the idea of a man in relation to gurus, or the idea that the guru is merely a human being. So we've discussed over the recent classes with reference to the Bhagavatam, the commentaries on Bhagavatam and other sources, how the Guru is perceived to be non-different from Bhagavan in the qualified sense that the Guru is the agent by which Bhagavan accomplishes his self-manifestness and is regarded as non-different from Bhagavan because of the mutual absorption at heart between Bhagavan and his bhakta, and the great dearness that the bhakta embodies for Bhagavan. So, having discussed the characteristics of the Guru and touched briefly on the ideal characteristics of a disciple and how the Guru is to be viewed, then lastly we'll conclude the subject matter with some additional parameters in this regard. In other words, as we've gone through, we've spoken about how the Guru is, so to speak, perceived to be divine, but we've also indicated that there are quote-unquote limitations to that, or there are bounds along which that understanding is meant to be fostered, and also areas in which it is not, and in which case doing so would be detrimental to those involved. So today we'll conclude this subject matter with perhaps a little bit on the sober end of the spectrum, with the balancing out the overall scope of behavior within the guru-disciple relationship, as there are innumerable instances of it over the course of time and history and individual circumstances, and how and when and where and what would be appropriate to whom is not, a singular thing, but is always unique to every specific situation. So what are the principles involved that can keep a set of checks and balances and sustain a relationship that will be as healthy as possible for everyone involved? Then these topics are also part of what the acharyas have taught and what are relevant to the subject. So today we'll look at that. So I'll just briefly go back slightly to this verse from the Taittiriya Upanishad that we left off with last time. So, it should also be understood in this regard, however, that although the, quote, idea of a man in relation to gurus is centered in the verse under discussion, and although the aforecited verses from Narada Pancharatra, Srimad Bhagavatam, and elsewhere teach that the Guru is to be seen as a manifestation of Bhagavan, that is, to be worthy of honor, Viṣṇu, but like Bhagavan, or like Viṣṇu, there is no implication in these statements that one should regard the Guru as omniscient or infallible. Rather, the Shastra, as well as all genuine Gurus, teach that a Guru can also on occasion make errors, or exhibit shortcomings, and disciples are not meant to fail to discern such errors and shortcomings, blindly follow their Gurus, or replicate those errors and shortcomings in their own actions or speech. This can be evidenced in a pair of statements in the Taittiriya Upanishad, which are part of a set of instructions given by an acharya to his students at the time of their graduation from Gurukul. So he says, Yanava dhyani karmani tani sevita vyani no itarani yanyasmakam sucharitani tani tvaya upasyani no itarani. Those acts which are unobjectionable are to be practiced, and not others, meaning the objectionable ones aren't. Those which are fine deeds of ours are to be honored by you, not others, meaning those deeds of ours that are not so excellent, those aren't the ones to be followed. The purport in regard to these final instructions of an acharya to his students is that his students should not simply replicate whatever it is they have observed him to have said or done, but rather they should understand the intended meaning of the Shastras and principles they have learned from the acharya and act in accord with the intention of these. In the aforecited instructions, the acharya is openly acknowledging that neither his own actions nor the actions of other learned persons are always necessarily perfectly in line with the intention of Shastra, and that a disciple is fundamentally instructed not to blindly follow whatever the acharya or other persons who may be regarded in society as learned in Shastra happen to do or say, but rather to personally strive to understand the intention of the Shastra and act and speak in accord with that. This purport has been articulated by commentators on this Upanishad. So here we have Shankaracharya's commentary. So he discusses this as follows, quote, "Also, those other acts which are unobjectionable, that is, non-condemned, and possessed of the characteristic of being the conduct of the learned, are to be practiced, that is, performed by you. Others, that is, those that are objectionable, even if they are performed by the learned, are not to be practiced by you. Only those fine deeds, that is, excellent deeds that are not contrary to the amnyaya, or the shastric tradition and so forth, of ours, that is, of the acharyas, are to be honored, that is, are to be known to be possessed of an unseen object," which is a classical way of saying to lead to otherworldly attainment, "and to be performed by you, meaning to be done with resolve by you. Others, that is, those actions that are contrary to actions that are in accord with the intention of the shastric tradition, even if they are those performed by acharyas, are not." So he's making it clear that the disciple is not meant to just do whatever the guru did, but the disciple is meant to understand the amnaya, or understand the whole tradition, understand the purpose of the tradition, the principles of the tradition, and then understand which acts, what type of speech is in conformity or is a valuable expression of that spirit and of that intent, and to do that to the extent that they are able. Similarly, Ramanujacharya, he comments as follows, "In regard to yani asmakam," that is the second statement in the aforementioned passage, "even within the conduct of the learned, those actions which are fine deeds by virtue of being free from contrariety or contrariety to the Shruti and Smriti, such as the act of observing Holaka, meaning the festival of Holi, are to be followed. Deeds the basis of which is greed and so on are not." This is the meaning. So he's implying that someone may be in the role of a teacher, may be in the role of a guru, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're completely free from greed or other vices, and that those vices may color some of their behavior. So the person is not meant to follow those acts which are colored by those vices, but rather meant to follow those which are colored by the intent, or in the spirit of the intent of the Shastra. Underlying this purport, too, is the principle that the responsibility of a guru is not to simply tell students what to do or think, but rather teach them how to think, how to use their own faculty of intellection and discernment, which according to Srimad Bhagavatam is the defining characteristic of a human being. In this phrase, Brahmavalokana-dishana, to effectively engage in deliberation so as to progressively practice and uphold Dharma, be it Dharma in the conventional sense or Dharma's ultimate form, namely Bhagavad-dharma. So this statement in the Upanishads is not made specifically with reference to the path of bhakti, but it's a principle that applies to all guru-disciple relations, whatever the path may be. So this is where push comes to shove, so to speak, or religions, scriptures, scriptural teachers, institutions, all varieties of authority are there to benefit people. But sometimes they get out of tune such that they end up becoming means of exploiting people or harming people or inadvertently failing to help people as much as they could. So it's a constant responsibility of every generation, of every participant in human society and in these institutions and in these traditions to participate in them with as much sincerity as possible such that they can fulfill the real purposes that they have. And you can say there's a never-ending tension between successfully fulfilling those intents and purposes within the midst of an ever-changing social environment. The nature of human society is shifting through time, through different changes in technology, in culture, in language, in climate, in so many other things. And as those changes unfold, the way in which the principles that are best that lead to the greatest fulfillment in human life may not be always expressed in the very same way. The same actions may not have the exact same connotations that they do in different cultural contexts, in different historical contexts, in different linguistic contexts. So to achieve your purpose, there's always the never-ending necessity of adjustment and attunement to the now, or to the actual circumstance in which one is functioning. So as this challenge is there, then sometimes certain activities or certain attitudes or certain norms or certain customs can become out of tune, or can become out of sync, or can become counterproductive. And when people are more invested in the norms than in the purposes that the norms were meant to fulfill, then there can arise, what you call, anachronism. And, sometimes in some contexts people use far less polite ways of describing it if frustration or abuse or other things take place. So we should, while some may have serious grievances that arise in this regard, at the same time, we can also understand that it's a never-ending challenge to keep up with the times and to, keep up with the spirit of whatever it is that one's seeking to achieve, especially in regard to the path of bhakti, and that it's ultimately an art, and it's ultimately a never-ending labor of love. So if certain people or groups or texts or whatever got a certain degree with it, then that should also be appreciated, even if something might be felt to still be desired. So, but what's critical here is, or when it becomes like acutely problematic, is when the authorities the aforementioned authorities, when they cease to empower people to fulfill their human potential, and rather, in the name of leading them to the fulfillment of their human potential, suppress their human potential. So, as the Bhagavatam here explains, the faculty of discernment, the faculty of the intellect, whereby language, culture, meaning, value, love, all of these things that are the unique riches, you can say, of human life, all of these things ride on people exercising the, finer and richer capacities that the intellect has. But if in the name of guiding people in using the intellect, there isn't actually guidance in allowing that to flourish and to be progressive, but rather there's a restricting or a homogenizing or an oversimplification of how these things are meant to be done, or how these human faculties have the potential for expression, then that ends up suppressing human potential rather than nourishing it. And the difficulty, if you will, is that the fresh human potential leads to change, it leads to new expression, it leads to beauty and richness. And if people are in a position of power or in a position of authority, this can be perceived as a threat, or this can be perceived as something that might draw attention or resources away from them and towards that novel progressive expression. So there can be an intentional or an unintentional drive to minimize that, so for the sake of sustaining one's own role, or sustaining one's own authority, or sustaining one's own livelihood, or what have you. So much of historically religious war and religious conflict has, been related to ideas or related to the meaning of scriptures, but in most cases is primarily driven not so much by the ideas or the spiritual significance of what's at play, but by the political and economic impact of the changes that, acceptance of certain ideas may create for those who have vested interests in the status quo. So to assume the role of an authority or in a culture, in a community or whatever, but to do so actually for the benefit of that community, for the well-being of the people that you claim to support, is obviously the oath of office, if you will, that one should have, just as, public servants are meant to take a vow when they, accept office, to say that we will use the resources of the government, the authority of the government to serve the people, but not exploit the people. But nevertheless, politics are ripe with corruption and people who seek their own interests and aggrandizement at the expense of people, and, by posing or taking the role of the leader or the supporter of them. So this also happens in religious contexts, and I don't mean to go off extensively, but just to say that the nucleus, or the core of all of that, the way that whole dynamic perpetuates, fundamentally boils down to this exact point, that people are either told how to think, or they're allowed to think and supported in refining and grasping what is an ideal way to think. So this is, you can say, the essential balance point, so to speak, in the role of the teacher, where they are someone who transmits ideas, who passes on information, who guides and, encourages someone in how they think and understand things, and is invested with a degree of trust. But they abuse that if they use that only to trap the person into fixed ways of thinking that perpetuate their power over them, and, that don't actually lead to the person's capacity to love, capacity to express love, capacity to, flourish on the path of bhakti actually coming about. So if the guru isn't willing to be accountable for their own imperfections or acknowledge their own mistakes, and uses their authority to, make the student doubt their own assessment of things and accept something right to be wrong, then, they desecrate the relationship and the trust that they've been invested in. So these points here in the commentaries of Ramanujacharya and Shankaracharya, they show that, these are comments that are over 1,000 years old, so in the last 1,000 years, have these things, and, sorry, I'm jumping back a step, and the works of Shankaracharya, the works of Ramanujacharya, these are widely available. These are, celebrated as, some of the most, widely accredited and authoritative acharyas in, the whole of the Vedantic tradition. And that they, in plain language, make these type of acknowledgements is very significant, and a very significant historical precedent for how the guru-disciple institution is meant to function, and how when it's, not done in the context of all of these texts and in the context of all of these parameters that have been laid out, how there's people neglect to avail themselves of checks and balances that would be very much in everyone's interest and in society's interest. So I wanted to just include these in particular, just because of the antiquity of their origin. But we do also find some similar remarks, or remarks to the same effect, within the works of our own Gaudiya Acharyas as well. So I have that here. Sri Narottam Das Thakur Mahashaya also affirms this teaching, that the directions of the Shastra are the basis of a disciple's study and following of a guru. So in the Prem Bhakti Chandrika, he writes, Shri Guru Bhakata Jan Tahara Charane Mon, Aropya Katha Anusare, Sakira Sarvata Mata, Hoya Tahara Yuta, Sadai Bihare, Brajapure. Shri Guru and the Bhaktas, or you could interpret it as Shri Guru in the form of a Bhakta, fixing the mind at their, or alternately his or her feet, in accord with the word, proceeding in all respects as approved by the Sakhis, and being a part of their group, always sport in the abode of Braja. So this is a little bit of a cryptic statement of Thakur Mahashai when he says here in the second line, Aropya Kotha Anusare. He's saying, fix your mind at the feet of the Guru, or the feet of the Bhakta, or the feet of the Guru who is a Bhakta. And then he says, but do so Kotha Anusare, in accord with, or Anusare, the Kotha. Following the Kotha, do this. So then you might say, well, whose Kotha? Which Kotha? Meaning the Guru's Kotha, right? Or which Kotha is it then? The verse itself, it doesn't specify. So what's interesting is the way that Vishwanath Chakravartipad in his commentary on the Prem Bhakti Chandrika contextualizes this. So he writes, Kotha Anusare Shastra Kotha Anusarena. That, quote, in accord with the word, Kotha Anusare, means in accord with the word of the Shastra. So he is here specifying that when it says, fix your mind at the feet of the Guru, it doesn't mean blindly follow whatever the Guru does and, quote, don't listen to your mind and only what the Guru says. It means trust the Guru, follow what the Guru says, according to the guidelines for that given in the scriptures, or given in the Shastra. So, meaning, as the Shastra teaches that one should accept a Guru, one should learn from a Guru these teachings, then do that. And, then, that will be the actual adherence to the Guru, or that's, quote, Guru Nishta as it's designed to be, rather than kind of a full stop sense of like blind allegiance is the only concept of, quote, chastity or, quote unquote, following of a Guru, but rather that how one follows a Guru also has rules, it also has parameters, and those have already been laid down in the Shastra, and it's meant to be done according to that. And guess what? Those parameters also include the fact that one should not follow the Guru blindly or think that they're completely infallible or all of this. So, if we see this, quote, Kotha Anusare, or according to what the Shastra says, as referring back then to the verse of the Upanishads that we discussed, as well as some of the other parameters that we discussed before, and some that we'll get to now. So thus, the manner in which one accepts, learns from, and follows a Guru is all meant to be guided by the Shastra, and not simply the personal preferences of the disciple or the dictates of the Guru, since the sincerity of both disciples and Gurus is not guaranteed. Sri Jivapad speaks to the existence of insincere Gurus and lesser or unqualified Gurus, that is, those who lack the characteristics specified in the aforecited Bhagavatam 11.3.21 and 4.29.51, with the following passage from Brahma-vaivarta Puran. So in the Bhakti Sandarbha, when he's talking about the different categories of Gurus that he lays out, the Shravan Guru, Diksha Guru, Shiksha Guru, and so forth, which we'll discuss some other time in the Chaitanya Charitamrita classes, he gives this particular point. This is a quote from the Brahma-vaivarta Puran. Vakta sarago nirago dvividha parikirtitaha sarago lulupa kami tadukdam hrin nasam sprishet upadesham karotyeva na pariksham karotticha apariksho padishtam yat lokanashaya tad bhavet. a teacher is said to be of two types, one with attachment and one without attachment. One with attachment is greedy and covetous. His words cannot touch the heart. He only gives teachings and does not conduct any examination. That which is taught without conducting any examination certainly leads to ruination of society. So, if anyone who an ignorant person accepts as a guru has to be treated as if they're possessed of all the characteristics that a guru is meant to have, even if they're not, then what will happen to society? Right? Then, you'll be, all hell will break loose, essentially. So, just because a group or some people may have, in their own lack of education, adopted a certain figure as an authority, doesn't actually make what that person says authoritative. But whether what the person says is of genuine value, whether it's in accord with the earlier tradition or the sampradaya or the shastra, this is all to be impartially evaluated. Simply because a group of people favor it out of their relative degree of capacity to appreciate anything of value or not, this isn't, a universal standard, and we can't then start to project, qualities or make certain assumptions about something on that basis. So here, Jiva Goswami is openly acknowledging that teachers may be selfishly motivated for accepting students, and also some are not. He's acknowledging there is a place for a guru in society, and it is possible to take that role of power and authority without being, egotistically motivated for doing so. It is possible that there is, quote, a niraga, or a detached or a non-attached teacher. But it doesn't mean that anyone who accepts that role is. There may be some who are saraga, which in this case is not the rag of raganuga bhakti, but the rag of the world, the rag of rag and dvesh. In other words, out of having worldly attachments and interests. So, what's also interesting here in this verse is this idea of examination. So I have a point about this. A point of consideration here is that the phrase, quote, does not conduct any examination, does not specify of whom any examination is made. So the statement is a little bit cryptic. In other words, the guru who has attachment, he doesn't conduct examination. So what kind of examination is that? It doesn't say. So in other words, it's left to the interpreter to consider what the meaning is. So one meaning can be taken that the guru does not examine the eligibility of students and teach them accordingly. And that meaning is repeated again in a passage that we'll get to in a minute, and is also can be contextualized from statements in the Haribhakti Vilas, where when the guru-disciple institution is explained, there are other verses quoted that say, it's a responsibility of a guru to conduct an examination of a disciple. In other words, there shouldn't be the giving of diksha or the giving of shiksha without demonstration of the necessary adhikar. And there's only one way to know if the adhikar is there: to look. In other words, you can't just assume that it's there. You have to actually see if it's there or not. You have to conduct an examination. And classically, it mentions that for brahmanas, 12 years of examination was recommended. For other varnas, 9 years or 3 years, or all different quotes are given of 6 months or 1 year or something. But there's various passages that simply say, unless the guru and disciple live together with each other, how else will they know? How will you know that someone is the way that they are or not, unless you actually be with them, unless you actually have your own experience of them? So especially in the modern day, where less and less of this takes place, and more there's much more distant guru-disciple relations, there's electronic guru-disciple relations, there's much less accountability, and there's much less actual personal relation and mutual verification involved in all of these practices. So this is, you could say, a challenge of the day. It's also an advantage of the day. In other words, in the past, unless you went and lived in the, hermitage or the school of the guru, there was no way that you could learn. So that was a great difficulty, and many people didn't have the chance to learn because of that. But those who did got the chance to really have a full relationship with the guru. So in the modern day, where you have technology and transportation and all of these facilities, you have much more potential for some exchange, but typically less distant and less personally enriched and with less mutual examination involved. So that has its drawbacks. And so when the scripture says that there should be mutual examination, what we can take from that is that just relying on the vouching of others is not really the way it's meant to be done. In other words, so-and-so or some group say that this person is wonderful, so I can just jump on the boat too. That's not really how the system and how the tradition is designed, but rather whether there's an actual sense of relation between you living your life and this teacher or not. That's also important. And ideally, there should be the chance for people to have that experience and to feel that sense of affirmation, so that when they do accept the guru, when they do hear the teachings of the guru, that really they hear those things, really they take those things to heart. You can hear a lot of information, but the level of conviction, the level of participation and commitment on the part of the student is also vastly influential in how effective they are in actually applying and realizing those teachings. So all of these things are to be considered. And of course, ultimately something's better than nothing, so to speak. So, we don't want to emphasize these things to such an extent that people feel that things are impossible. But at least we can understand the sliding scale of what's ideal and pursue it according to what our life and circumstances allow. Now, another consideration I want to bring here is a second interpretation of this idea of examination. So I was just talking about the first one, which you might call the more common or conventional interpretation, but it can also be interpreted like this, quote, "A second meaning can also be taken that the guru does not examine within his own life the content which he teaches others. That is, he does not sincerely deliberate on, apply, and thereby ultimately experience and affirm the positive result of what he is teaching. The teaching of a teacher who neglects to conduct both of these examinations leads to disturbance in society." So if I may, I'll just offer a personal footnote and say the second interpretation is an interpretation that my Guru Maharaj favors, and I've discussed with him on relation to this verse multiple times, and he's repeatedly asked me to check numerous different editions of the Bhakti Sandarbha to see if anyone gives this second interpretation anywhere, because he thinks that this second interpretation really matters. And there is one Bengali edition of the text which does give an interpretation which can be taken in this second sense. So this is a view that he certainly favors, that it's if a person is taking the role of a teacher, but they themselves haven't truly followed the path of what they teach, and they themselves really haven't succeeded in proving the concept in their own life, so to speak, then that betrays attachment on their part. Or in other words, that betrays the lack of sincerity in their adoption of that role. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to apply that to the maximum extent and say, unless you're a Siddha Mahapurush, you can't be a guru. But nevertheless, that certainly the task of being a guru should be at most a secondary function in a person's life and shouldn't eclipse their own personal responsibilities as a bhakta and as a sadhaka. And if they become more preoccupied with, busying themselves with telling others how to be when they themselves haven't actually brought these things into fruition in their own life, that this this ultimately doesn't really benefit anyone. It doesn't truly benefit that person who's already on the path and could be further progressing on the path if they didn't decide to bother themselves with other people more than themselves. And it doesn't really benefit others to that great of an extent, because those persons might do better to have a teacher who's already reached that more progressive status. So this second interpretation is also, in my footnote here, worthy of consideration. Okay, so teachers can be of two types, with or without attachment. This is openly acknowledged, in other words. So Jiva Gosvami, he also offers some, you could say, management guidelines, so to speak, or when there are issues at play, then what to do. So this comes from the Bhakti Sandarbha a little bit later on. He says, Sri Jiva Pad speaks to a lack of sincerity and qualification on the part of a disciple in Bhakti Sandarbha 238, as he discusses the difficulties that arise from accepting someone unqualified as a guru. So sometimes people, if they end up with a guru who's not qualified, they can get into a victim mentality and blame the person for their wrong behaviors. But because it's actually they themselves who accepted that person as a guru, and in most cases they weren't all that educated in the scripture to make a proper examination in the first place, they also have to own that fate to a certain extent and recognize that just because so-and-so was part of such and such institution or had such and such fame or was, written such and such books, that therefore one can just blindly, go along with whatever, that's actually a lack of rigor or of care about what the needs that are required for one's own path to be successful. So obviously it's an unfortunate situation, but there should be recognition of responsibility on both sides. So Jiva Goswami deals with this as follows. Quote, one who firstly did not take shelter in a guru endowed with the characteristics stated in śabde parecha nishnatam, that is, in the Bhagavatam verse we discussed earlier, who does not receive permission to honor and so forth great Bhagavatas, as a result of envy and the like on the part of an unqualified guru, that one has accepted instead of a genuine guru, and who indeed from the first is one by who the Shastra has been rejected. That is, there's a typo, one who has not followed the Shastra. Alternately, is one whom the Shastra has rejected, is not being deliberated upon here in this text. So let me just pause here for a sec. This is a little bit of an interesting phrase that Jiva Goswami writes, and translators interpret it in two different ways, and grammatically both are possible. Jiva Goswami here calls this person who accepted an unqualified person as a guru as, quote, tyakta shastra. Tyakta shastra. So you can interpret that to mean one who rejected the Shastra, in other words, one who didn't accept a guru following the guidelines that the Shastra gives for how to accept one. Or it can mean one who the Shastra rejects, meaning one who the Shastra isn't going to give, guidelines for, because, and then it comes back to the same point, because the person wasn't following what the Shastra was saying in the first place. In other words, if, a parent tells a child, don't run across the street without looking both ways before you cross the road, and then the child runs out in the street without looking both ways before they cross the road, and then gets into an accident, you can't come to the parent and say, hey, why didn't you, protect your kid? It's like, I taught the kid how to cross the road, but if the kid, I can't be with the kid every single day, 24 hours a day, and I can't, live with the kid the entirety of their life, but I can teach them how to tie their shoes, I can teach them how to cross the road, but if they don't look both ways and they don't tie their shoes and they get in an accident, you can't blame the parent. So something like that, you can't blame the Shastra for people going along with these processes without actually following the guidelines that the Shastra gave. So if someone ends up into a problem because they didn't follow the guidelines, then who is that person? Well, they're a guidelines rejecter, so to speak. They didn't follow the guidelines in the first place, and then they ended up in a mess. So what kind of mess would that be? Then he gives an example by saying that does not receive permission to honor great Bhagavatas. So this harkens back to the verse previously about attachment. When you have a guru who has a vested interest in disciples, in their donations, in the power he gets from them, in the other facilities he gets from them, then he may restrict them from honoring or associating with other Vaishnavas, because that's, those are resources and manpower that he loses in his attached viewpoint. That persons may come to appreciate others and not sort of see him as the all in all. Then from an egotistical perspective, this might rub on him. So he may say, no, you're not allowed to go here, you're not allowed to go there, you're not allowed to honor this person or that person or what have you. So if one ends up under the influence of someone like this, then one runs into a trap, so to speak. And so Jiva Goswami explains the trap that this is. So he says, since the breadth of both dilemmas certainly befall him, which is, again, a little bit of a cryptic statement, but what he means is this. Since this disciple faces the dilemmas of, quote, failing to obey the guru by honoring great Bhagavatas, and failing to honor great Bhagavatas by obeying the guru. So the disciple should not disobey the guru, the disciple should not neglect to honor Vaishnavas. But if you're in a situation where you by doing one, you don't do the other, then you end up committing offense either way. So then you're stuck. But you should realize that you got yourself stuck into that because you got yourself put into a position where you're getting orders that ought not be obeyed, and then, forced into a situation where you feel the need to disobey the order. So, in other words, what Jiva Goswami is saying is that a genuine guru will never discourage a disciple from honoring other Vaishnavas or honoring other great Vaishnavas. And we came across an example of that point also earlier in a commentary of Vishwanath Chakravarti, some few classes back. So he says, specifically with reference to this and the like, that is, and other dilemmas, so this isn't the only problem, he's just giving an acute example of a problem, but essentially, anytime you end up in a situation where you have a guru who's teaching things that are against what the Shastras teach, then you either neglect to follow certain practices that you're meant to practice, like honoring Vaishnavas, or another would be sadhumarga nugamam, following the traditions set by the Mahajans of the past. If you have a guru who, goes against those customs, goes against those precedents set by the Mahatmas, then you end up having to, do one undesirable thing or the other. So in all such cases, it is said in the Narada Pancharatra, quote, both one who speaks devoid of rule, that is, instructs things that are contrary to the intent of the Shastra, and one who listens devoid of rule, that is, follows things that are contrary to the intent of Shastra, proceed to a dark hell for unlimited time. So this is about as stiff of language as you can possibly use. So here you can see it's directly forbidden for a disciple to, quote, listen devoid of rule. In other words, to not think critically, to not listen and practice according to, a principled sense of conscience that's guided by the principles and the broader tradition, meaning the Shastra. This is forbidden and leads you to hell. This point is very serious, because what so often happens is that people in power, gurus, convince people not to use their own conscience and just blindly follow what they say, and scares them with the consequences of disobeying the guru for not blindly following along. But here, it is said that to blindly follow along will also lead you to hell. So, this point is reiterates the point that we made earlier regarding the essential faculty of human life as being the faculty of the buddhi, the faculty of discernment. So, to deny, to suppress the essential characteristic of your own humanity, what greater self-betrayal is there than that? And who is a bigger exploiter of you than someone who comes along and convinces you to deny your own humanity to yourself in the name of saving you from material existence or giving you divine love or salvation or whatever they offer you? This is a very serious point that one should never, allow oneself to be convinced to betray one's own self, but rather, and interestingly, there's another verse in the Bhagavatam in the 11th canto that speaks about the importance of accepting a guru to cross over the ocean of samsara, and says that one who does not is an atmaghati, or a destroyer of themselves. So on the one hand, you have this statement saying, if you don't accept the guru who's like the guide on the boat that's pushed by the favorable wind of the grace of Krishna to cross over samsara, if you don't use that valuable human life captained by the guru, then you're a destroyer of yourself. So oftentimes that verse is leveraged to speak about the necessity of having a guru, because the guru is the captain of the boat. So, agreed, the guru is the captain of the boat. But what's the boat? The boat is the human life. And what is human life? The essential characteristic of human life is the faculty of vivek, is the faculty of discernment. So, you're also an atmaghati, or a self-mutilator, or a self-betrayer, if you deny your own self the capacity, or you don't give yourself the opportunity to use that faculty, which is itself the boat that the guru is meant to guide. So, the role then of the guru is to guide the boat. In other words, to allow the faculty to function and move as it's meant. But that doesn't mean simply that it just gives it a fixed set of, orders and says march, and that it's merely that simple. But rather that it means that the motion, the progress on this movement is the grace of Krishna, right? So when, according to the grace, according to the teaching, according to the favorable things descending by the grace of Bhagavan, then the guru is guiding the person how to channel that, how to work with that. So that's not simply a fixed set of rituals and daily regulations, but this is a whole disposition, a whole way of opening and orienting oneself to the whole of the world and one's life, the inner context, exterior context, all of these things combined. So anyway, I don't mean to elaborate excessively, but just to say that this is another point of evidence that shows that it's the responsibility of the person to practice these things with a conscience, with a living sense of responsibility and an understanding of the momentous of the decisions that they take, of the reflection that they do, of the contemplation that they engage in. After all, it's shrotavya, mantavya, nididhyasitavya, that it's to be heard from the guru and to be contemplated and then to be meditated upon or to be practiced. So, with that in mind, let's continue the passage here. Therefore, such a guru, that is a guru devoid of the characteristics enjoined in the Shastra, who teaches things that are contrary to the intent of the Shastra, is to be honored only from afar. That is, one should not keep such a guru's company. So, if one has accepted a guru according to the traditions of the Sampradaya, then that should also be honored. But if the practical exchange that's meant to be taking place is not actually happening, then there should be distance. there should be respect, but there should be distance such that something contrary to what's meant to be happening doesn't happen. If, however, he is inimical to Vaishnavas, that is, if on top of not functioning in an ideal way, there's a situation where there's actually directly contrary and implication in offense by doing or saying what this guru is teaching, then he is verily to be rejected. In other words, one can't allow oneself to be taken down what is contrary to the path of one's well-being, what is contrary to the path of bhakti, such as criticism of Vaishnavas, honoring of Vaishnavas, even if that's what a guru is saying. So if a guru is putting someone in a position where they're forced to do that, then that guru is to be rejected. Because of the statement in the Smriti, so quote, rejection is enjoined for even a guru who is arrogant, unaware of what is to be done and not to be done, and set out on a wrongful path. And because of such a guru's being the object of, the statement, one shall go to hell as a result of receiving a mantra imparted by a non-Vaishnava. If one has received a mantra from a non-Vaishnava, again and properly according to rule, one should occasion reception of a mantra from a Vaishnava guru. On account of such a guru's being a non-Vaishnava, as a result of his lack of the attitude of a Vaishnava. Since the inclination to honor great Vaishnavas is well known to be a characteristic of a Vaishnava's attitude, and such a guru lacks this. So what he's saying is that he quotes this statement that you go to hell if you take a mantra from a non-Vaishnava. And then he's saying, and what does it mean to be a non-Vaishnava? Does it mean that that person might not have diksha in a Vaishnava mantra lineage? No, that's not what he means. He's saying that someone could be in an official sampradaya. Someone could have diksha in an unbroken parampara or whatever, whatever conventional standards there are that make someone a Vaishnava. So, but yet it's saying if you take a mantra from a non-Vaishnava, you can go to hell. So how can there be a non-Vaishnava who has meets all the external definitions of being a Vaishnava? So then he explains, quote, being a non-Vaishnava as a result of the lack of the bhav of a Vaishnava. So what really makes you a Vaishnava? Is it just that you went through a ritual and, with someone else who went through another ritual in some way that's perceived as socially authoritative? No. What makes you a Vaishnava is that you have the bhav of a Vaishnava. And an essential feature of the bhav of a Vaishnava is adoration for Vaishnavas, is regard for Vaishnavas, and is great care to avoid offending Vaishnavas. So if someone has the external trappings of being a Vaishnava but lacks this bhav, and not only lacks this bhav, but has the opposite, in other words, has an attitude which is offensive to Vaishnavas, disrespectful to Vaishnavas, and then on top of that is then pushing that non-Vaishnava mood into you and saying, no, don't respect these Vaishnavas because they have such and such doctrinal deviations. Don't respect such and such Vaishnavas because they have such and such character flaws, or don't respect such Vaishnavas because of X or because of Y, or for whatever reason only think that me or my group is real Vaishnavas and everybody else they're Vaishnavas but not really Vaishnavas, so you don't really have to respect them. That mentality is the non-Vaishnava mentality. That is the appearance of Vaishnavata, which is actually non-Vaishnavata, or what Jiva Gosvami here is calling this lack of a bhav of a Vaishnava. So when someone lacks that bhav of a Vaishnava, oh gosh, the line dropped. One sec. Okay. Okay, sorry, I think I got it back up now. So what I was saying is that just to finish this topic. So what Jiva Gosvami is saying is that the Shastra enjoins rejection of someone who's leading you down the wrong path. And the Shastra enjoins, taking Diksha again from someone who has the bhav of a Vaishnava, if you're with someone who's leading you down the wrong path. And what would be an example of leading you down the wrong path? It would be someone who's teaching you not to respect Vaishnavas, someone who's teaching you to neglect or that it's unnecessary to honor great Vaishnavas who are, by scriptural perception, worthy of great honor. So in that situation, because there's a lack of the bhav of a Vaishnava, there's a status of being a non-Vaishnava. And if you follow a non-Vaishnava, you don't end up with the bhav of a Vaishnava. So therefore it says, if you've been received a mantra from a non-Vaishnava, you can go to hell. So therefore one should again occasion reception, or one should again receive the mantra from a Vaishnava. So in this way, he's showing that the responsibility of the disciple is to, quote, listen according to rule, or in other words, to listen with a conscience, to listen with the faculty of the intellect, such that they can, such that one discerns what is the actual bhav of a Vaishnava, what is the actual code of conduct, and then proceeds accordingly. So in this way, it's essential to be under a guru who has the ideal characteristics of a guru. Sorry, I forgot to push the button. Sorry about that, I've just been going on for a few minutes. Pardon me for that. So I won't repeat myself twice, but I was just finishing the explanation of this point. So essentially, when someone lacks the bhav of a Vaishnava, then they're perceived as a non-Vaishnava. If one is following a non-Vaishnava, one will not end up becoming a Vaishnava. So one should no longer remain in connection with the one who lacks the bhav of a Vaishnava, and instead connect with someone who has that bhav. Since bhav is the object of sadhan, the whole aim and whole purpose of taking diksha, of being a sadhaka, is to achieve the bhav of a Vaishnava. So in this way, the responsibility is evident on the part of the student to use their conscience, use their faculty of discernment, and navigate their course as they're meant to. So, long story short, comes back something very simple. You should live your life in an intelligent way. You should care about your life, and you should, plot your course in a way that will lead to your own best interest, regardless of whether that, falls along the lines of, conformity with any particular groups or any particular established institutions or not. But what matters is the ideals and the choices that you as an individual make, and not simply what are social perceptions or, the norms within certain groups or what have you. So in this way, all these points ultimately underscore the importance of knowing the Shastra, understanding what the characteristics of a guru are according to the Shastra, and following a guru who has those characteristics. And in this way, one can both be free from this idea of quote-unquote merely thinking the guru is a human being or a limited mortal and not a manifestation of Bhagavan. One can faithfully recognize the divinity in the guru, but at the same time not be a blind sheep who goes off and ends up doing all these things that are contrary to what the whole culture and the whole scripture is meant to lead one to in the first place. So with all these parameters in place, we can see the intended scope of the censure given in the verse we're talking about, and we can have a realistic, grounded, balanced attitude about the guru-disciple relationship. So, thus, the censure in the verse under discussion of, quote, the idea of a man in relation to gurus should be understood to inculcate reverence for the guru and recognition of Bhagavan's grace and agency of self-manifestation manifesting through the guru to whatever extent that is, present while not stipulating that a guru is infallible, omniscient, or meant to be considered and treated literally equal to Bhagavan himself. Okay, I'm a little bit over time, but now finally, I don't know how many that was, 6 classes or something, we've gone on this topic, so now that will be laid to rest. So if anyone has any final comments, questions, corrections, or anything else on what we've covered today, please feel free.
Maharaj?
Yes.
So I'm feeling there's a little bit of a cultural thing here. I feel my experience is that gurus of late don't make any effort to understand the disciple. I mean, that may be not true across the board, but I especially experience it as a female, that of course I know there's a cultural problem there, that a renounced guru is not really going to want to get to know his female disciple that well, unless they're in a marital relationship and he knows the couple. So it seems like that's not meant to be for me. So I'm expected to get to know the guru, but he takes no energy to get to know me. So can you comment, please?
I think that is it is socially a little delicate. In other words, with the gender dynamic, the renunciation dynamic, there's naturally going to be some distance in that context, which isn't the same that what the person might have with persons in other roles, so to speak. But, I would just say it depends on the needs and inclinations of an individual. If people want that, greater relationship with the guru, it would sure be nice if the guru could reciprocate. To me, a lot of times it's an issue of scale, and there's a tendency in the modern day, partially due to some of the technology and so forth that we have, where people accept so many disciples that they don't really have a very close relation with many of them at all, and that some who come along who want that don't get that opportunity because there's just quote unquote too many people around, or it's understandably a lot for one guru to have all that much of a relation with a huge number of people. So personally, as there was a 1970s book about popular among environmentalists called "Small is Beautiful," and it was, all about like how agriculture and industry, that now everything's getting so scaled up and everyone's thinking all this progress is great, but isn't small actually beautiful? Like, what about cottage industries or little household organic farms? And like, what about gurus with like just a few close disciples? Isn't that also beautiful? Isn't that also cool? I think so anyway, but I guess not everybody does. So I can't say that there's I can't pass judgment on anyone, and people have different prerogatives and people have different needs. But also, in many cases, if someone wants a more involved relationship and they arrive and they see a person that already has a whole bunch of followers, they can kind of understand up front that there might not be that much scope for it. So sometimes it can be avoided if people are clear about the level of relationship that they're seeking when they come into it, and they can observe how much relation that guru is offering to his existing group of disciples. That can also give them some parameter about whether that might be a good fit for them. But in the case of, places where relationships are already formed, then, whatever the inclination, so to speak, or the norm that is established, essentially the guru sets the norm, whatever it may be. And if a disciple doesn't have that chance for as much relationship as they want, then, if they come across another person who they feel the opportunity for that with and have that kind of conviction in, then with the support of their own guru, they can also pursue and have some type of further relationship with another I mean, there is grounds for that. Jiva Goswami speaks about that in the Bhakti Sandarbha by saying that if it doesn't conflict with the service of one's own guru, then honoring and serving other Vaishnavas is highly beneficial. So sometimes you'll find situations like that where if there isn't the opportunity for as much relationship as one wants with one's own guru, then with someone else who has that that openness, it may be cultivated there if such a person comes along. So according to the stage, the personal needs, the circumstances, then different remedies or different balances are possible.
Good. Thank you very much.
Yes, another hand.
Pranam, Baba.
Pranam.
I just have a small question. Does the term Bhagavad-dharma mean Uttama Bhakti path?
Yeah, generally speaking, we can consider it synonymous.
Or the path of Bhakti in general?
I mean, here we're talking about Bhagavad-dharma in the context of Srimad Bhagavatam. The Bhagavatam ultimately teaches Uttama Bhakti or Ahoituki Bhakti according to the viewpoint of our acharyas. So you could say for us, those things are synonymous in the way that we see and practice them. But in a broader, if you take it to like a full-scale, broad societal context, then there are people who might, have a more general or a looser idea of bhakti or of, quote, Bhagavad Dharma or practices related to Bhagavan where they're not practicing it as per the principles of Uttama Bhakti that are taught in the Bhagavatam. So there can be a different application or role of that phrase depending on the context.
Understood. Oh, and also, I was wondering about the quote of Jiva Gosvami from the last class, where he was describing the meditation on the worship of Bhagavan at the Yoga Pitha. There was a mention of the Shri Guru being placed at a spot to Bhagavan's left side. I was just wondering, what is the significance of this, or is there any significance of Shri Guru being particularly on the left side and not on the right? And if so, could you please elaborate on it? Why on the left?
Generally, there's a convention that to place something on the right is to place it in a position of respect. Just as we make offerings with the right hand, we don't do certain things with the left hand. No offense to the left-handers of the world, but generally speaking, there's a custom where respect is shown by doing something with the right hand or putting it on the right side. So, when you see deities of Radha and Krishna or Lakshmi and Narayan, Krishna is to the right of Radharani. Narayan is to the left. She's honoring him by sitting to his left, putting him on her right, so to speak. So similarly in the Yog Pit, to say that the Guru is placed to the left, the idea is that the Guru is in the position of a bhakta or a worshipper and is positioning himself such that Bhagavan is to his right, or is positioned such that the Bhagavan is in the position of honor in relation to the Guru. This would be the basic concept.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think one other hand I see.
Pranam, Baba.
Pranam.
Thank you for the presentation. At the beginning of the class, you were mentioning how the Guru may not be perfect, and then towards the end you mentioned about using one's discernment, and I find that if one should follow basically whatever is according to scripture. But if one were to see some things that were, not, okay, sorry, I'm trying to see how to trying to formulate the question here. I find it difficult to harmonize, to see the guru as, we worship Guru as a representation of Bhagwan. And because we see him as a representation of Bhagwan, to use the discernment and just, to not follow certain things that may not be, that the guru may be doing or whatever, as you mentioned at the beginning of the class, to harmonize the two, I find very difficult, in the sense that without it bothering the mind, because we are worshipping them as Bhagavan, and especially if the guru is...
Wait, sorry, when you say worshipping as Bhagavan...
as a representation of Bhagavan. So he is, but the guru is, Devatama. He is the Anushtana of Bhagavan. So we are worshipping him as, as Bhagavan. So
I mean, when you as Bhagavan, I mean, we're not
Bhagavan,
literally dressing him with a peacock feather and right? I mean,
no, he is your Gurudev. So then I just find that to use the discernment, to see if any, if there are any, like in behavior, as you mentioned at the beginning of the class, how to harmonize that. Sorry, if you're not understanding the question, it's okay. I'll formulate it later and ask it. I'm sorry.
I mean, I think it might be in this idea of, quote, the guru is Bhagavan. I mean, in the classes that we've had a lot of discussion to show that the guru is a bhakta, and he's held to be specially worshipable because this principle of self-manifestation is coming through him, because he's very dear to Bhagavan. This is the sense in which he's Bhagavan, so to speak. But that we would literally worship the guru as Bhagavan, that obviously we don't do. We don't offer tulsi leaves at the feet of the guru. We don't dress the guru in the dress that Bhagavan wears. We don't see that the guru is doing lila the way Bhagavan does lila. There's a very tangible distinction at the same time. So, practically speaking, what these things are saying is that the guru should be shown the greatest regard, the greatest reverence, with great affection, with great adoration. We should cherish and honor the guru, according to the norms that a guru is worshipped, which are not identical to the norms in which the deity is worshipped, or in which, in our case, Krishna is worshipped. We're not dressing him like Krishna. We're not, considering him to literally be Krishna in any sense like that. So, also, we're learning from the guru. He's teaching us. He's speaking Harikatha to us. He's showing by his example how to practice bhakti. And then we're learning and we're following that, and we're, providing whatever practical services are asked of us or are applicable and able for us to offer in a manner that suits his personal preferences and style. And those aren't the same things as what takes place in the divine Leela, so to speak, the food preferences or the, dietary preferences of a person in this world are whatever they are, and that's all perfectly fine, whatever they may be. So we're just, applying and expressing this faithful spiritual adoration for this person according to the context and the parameters that we have. And we're learning all these teachings and we're practicing all these teachings, and we're not fault finding or like on some, radar freak out mode about we're not just like looking for faults or anything like that. But, I'm bringing all these points just because there just does need to be the parameters in place. Ideally, these things hardly ever come up or cross our minds, and practically speaking, we can just be happy and, and have loving and affectionate and respectful dealings with gurus and with our other Vaishnavas and all of that, But these principles are necessary to know because, sadly, in some cases, in the lives of some, they are also applicable. So those parameters are there to be regarded, but they don't need to be, on the top of our, thoughts on a regular basis or something we're worried about, so to speak. They're just there, should whatever, somehow, if they're somehow come up. So I don't know if that offers a few thoughts on your considerations, but that's what comes to mind.
Yes, I just I guess also the fact that if not that one would be on the radar, but just because if a guru from whom we are learning from, whose teachings and example we are following, if something is is not at par or different, then or different from what the guru may be saying and doing something opposite, for example. So in a case like that, the mentality of the disciple would be difficult in the sense that especially if you're learning from the guru who is the one who is departing the knowledge, and the example being like the acharya. So that's where I found like today's class a little harder to swallow because using the discernment, well, I can't put myself as someone knowing better, obviously. So that's why I found it a little...
So you can't put yourself as someone knowing better.
Well, yes. Well, who am I to find fault? I don't know better. That is that's my mentality. I don't know better. I mean, yes, I know Shastra. I'm learning Shastra, but I do not know it as well as my guru. So who am I to see any shortcomings?
I mean, that's up to you to decide. I mean, if suppose you saw someone get hurt, would you think, oh, they weren't hurt? If someone comes to you and says, oh, I was just hurt in this way, would you say, well, I must not be seeing the fact that you're hurt properly?
Yes, but
I mean, I'm maybe an extreme case, but it's like,
yes.
Like, there should ultimately, like, as an individual, we have feelings, we have, a sensibility. If something trips that, it's not, so to speak, a decision that we make. It's something that we actually feel, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
So if we live in like a sense of like, well, anything I feel must be wrong because I don't know, like that can lead to a state of self-disassociation. Like we have to recognize the feelings that we ourselves have. We have to, exercise the faculty to feel that we possess. If something comes up, we should be able to clearly identify the feeling that we have, and then, consider why that might be, and then, proceed in a respectful, appropriate manner. But we don't want to get into a point where we become like self-denying of our own emotions or our own reflections.
Right.
But if, if someone is going on and, so to speak, nothing is bothering them, then it's like, don't try to be bothered just to be bothered. Obviously not, but, typically, it's the opposite way around, where if something happens and it actually, it hurts, or if, it feels uncomfortable to someone, then they shouldn't have this like doctrine make them like suppress their own feelings. That's not how the process is designed.
Thank you. I'll have to ponder on that some more. Thank you.
Sure. All right, well, we're way over time for today, so I'll conclude here if I may. And if we're so blessed, then in our next session, we'll dive into the next topic, which will be a bit intricate, and I'll just introduce it next time since we're out of time for today. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe
Jai Shri Radhe.
Shyam.